But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest.
To tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship.
Now, to go on to the word fascism, I would describe the type of government into which we have evolved as essentially fascist, yes.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Trust the experts, trust the experts. Trust the science, trust the science. CDC, CDC, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Fauci. Mask on, mask off, 2 shots, 1 shot, mask on, 2 masks. Comply, comply.
Welcome to the Exit Your Matrix podcast, where we take the deep dive in search of truth. On the journey, we examine critical topics such as natural law, consciousness, morality, individual sovereignty, and the occult. And here's your host, Brad Villers. Happy New Year, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Exit Your Matrix podcast. Yes, one day, out there in the future somewhere, perhaps even in the metaverse, you can be bouncing your grandchild on your knee, and you can look down at him or her, or I guess any number of pronouns, and you can say, Elon, I was there. I was there for the first one. So all kidding aside, I do hope this is an impactful podcast. We probably have a long way to go before we get to that place where you're telling your grandchildren about it, but that's my hope. So let me give you a little bit of background about me, what this is all about, and why I'm doing it. So I'm a pretty typical person. Got my college degree, met my wife, started a family, started a career, put one foot in front of the other for decades. And then with some encouragement from my best friend Jay and some other people who were around me who were exposed to different information than I had, started to encourage me to look at different sources of information, different interpretations of reality and what was going on, different explanations for why things happen. And I started a process of awakening. And that's been going on for about 12 years, and it's been incredible. I have completely changed my thinking, I think dramatically different than I used to. I like to think that I have found elements of truth. But the purpose of this show is really to find the truth. Truth with a capital T. And that can't be found by chasing the news of the day and trying to understand what that is. Over this past decade, I think I've developed some pretty good skills at being able to parse what's real, what's not, what's truth, what isn't. But I found out about a year ago that I was having trouble because I felt like I was just chasing one new piece of news after the other. So over the past decade, I've found, for example, incredible podcasts and sources of information and people who are interpreting what's going on in the world, investigative reporters. All of these different collections of information came together, and I've been able to, I think, develop a good set of skills when it comes to evaluating individual circumstances. But what I was lacking and really came to understand that I needed was a broader framework, a more fundamental framework for looking at the world, looking at my existence, human existence, the whole 9 yards. And so about 6 months ago, I completely stumbled across this. If you've done the rabbit hole, you know what I'm talking about. But I found a gentleman by the name of Mark Passio. And almost instantly, I think I found what I was looking for. Because what Mark teaches are very fundamental principles, things like natural law and morality, things that we don't talk about today, but are very much real, very much observable in our reality. And so with that, I wanted to share this information. So what am I trying to accomplish with this show? What's it all about? And I think the best way to answer that is to walk through my goals. First and foremost, it is to share content that I believe reveals and is the truth. Again, big T truth, talking about things that are universal and explain and help us understand how we're supposed to organize ourselves, how we're supposed to interact with one another as human beings, and really what we're supposed to do to pursue our potential. Secondly, I'd like to raise the level of dialogue. I'm not sure about you, but it seems to me we have become a culture, and this is not unique to the United States, it's growing, but a culture of very short attention spans, an absolute fascination with entertainment, and that worries me. I think that there are some other things that are far more important than those. So I'll use as an example. If you go back, if you're my age, but you can look it up, go look at debates between Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley Jr. Now I know this sounds prehistoric and probably very dry and uninteresting, but if you go back and look, or if you're familiar with it, you will know that their level of dialogue and interaction is completely different than what you see today. Their vocabulary, the way they're able to form arguments, the way they're able to defend their arguments is in a complete different class that I rarely see in our current environment. And I'd like to return to that. I'd like to see more of that. Third, I want to prompt interest. So one thing that you should know is my absolute belief that you should not believe, you should not trust what I'm telling you. Hopefully it will prompt an interest, it will create some curiosity, but ultimately you have got to go out and do the work yourself. You need to go out and not just believe what I'm telling you, or not just throw away what I'm telling you, hopefully, but investigate it and figure out for yourself if it's true or what you think the truth is. Finally, I'm motivated, just like my mentor, Mark Passio, to have people understand this information, become interested in it, become passionate about it, like I have, and go out and teach it to others in whatever way that you can. It's also important to point out that this is not my information. I am simply collecting and aggregating information that I have found to be truthful and have observed it to be truthful, and I'm wanting to share it with you. Simply packaging it in a hopefully appealing way that will prompt not only dialogue, but most importantly, thought. Now, while this is not my information, from time to time I will have an opinion and I'll share that, and I'll try to call that out and be very clear about what is my opinion or my thought or belief versus what I'm presenting and what I've captured from others. Also, this information is not popular, which I'm very well aware of. So this is going to really fly in the face of and be contrary to what so many of us spend so much of our time doing, which is working and taking care of family and social media and entertainment and sports and all of the things that we occupy ourselves with. And again, I'm not saying that those aren't unimportant things. I take part in those myself. I enjoy a good football game, but I think we're a little bit out of balance here. In fact, I think we're a lot out of balance in terms of what we spend our time on and what we pay attention to. You should know that there are logical fallacies that can be committed in this process. And I'll cover a couple of them, although there may be others, but I think these are the two main ones. And the first is judging the veracity of information that you receive based upon an emotional reaction to it. So what I can tell you is that at some point in this process, if you listen long enough, I am going to say something that you're going to disagree with, perhaps vehemently, and that may trigger you even. If it's something serious enough and involves a personal situation you or someone you know or love has been through. The only way to evaluate this information correctly is through logic and reason. And the second is that the truth of the information itself, has no connection to your opinion about it. In other words, they are entirely independent of one another. So you can think whatever you want to think or believe whatever you want to believe, and that has no impact whatsoever on whether the information is true. I've also come to understand that the pursuit of truth is comprised of two key components. The first is what I've referenced already, which is natural law, the occult, consciousness, morality. Call it the content, the stuff. But the second is often overlooked, but I think absolutely critical, and that is the state of the mind of the person receiving the information. And so if that person's mind is receptive, open, has the ability to engage with new information, that's going to be a completely different scenario than if that person is closed-minded, dealing with a lot of artifacts from their upbringing or other influences. Finally, I invite and encourage you to do two things. Number one, engage in probabilistic thinking. So I heard that term used on a podcast recently. I was pretty interested, looked into it, and I understand it has a formal definition. That's really not what I'm going for. I'm using it more anecdotally, and if I can use a little bit of license here, I'm talking about taking your knowledge and your mind, your mental thinking capacity, and coupling it with information that you, no one else, but that you deem to be accurate and truthful, and coming up with a conclusion. And basing that conclusion on probability. What seems more likely? Not what did the experts say, but what do you think about that? Using probability, using reason, and using logic. And the second thing I would encourage you to do is engage your imagination. It's really interesting as I go back and look at the people who have really influenced me and who I think are speaking truth. Almost all of them talk about the importance of imagination. And I don't think we focus enough on that, and we're too busy stuck in the reality of what we are in. But we have to engage our imagination. We have to do things like ask the question, what would it be like if? Or, what would I be like if? Or, what could I do if? Again, use your imagination. These are things that we don't typically use these days, and we're not taught to use, but they're critical. Continuing with the theme of the importance of the condition of mind with respect to this data, I've assembled at least what I think are the tenets of a receptive mind. And I'll go into those in just a minute, but before doing so, a couple of notes. First of all, these are not things, at least in my opinion, that you either have or you don't have. I think they exist in all of us to varying degrees. And the key idea here is to identify where we may be lacking in some of them or need work, and move those to greater levels of accomplishment. Secondly, wherever you are on that spectrum of either having or not having these individual tenets, I think it's important to understand that you can still arrive at and you can still interpret the information correctly, but it's going to be more challenging the more deficient you are in these categories. So let's kick it off. The first, and in my opinion, by far the most important tenet of a receptive mind is the ability and desire to do your own thinking. So as I look back over the last 12 years to the people who have really risen to the top in terms of their impact on me and the value of their thinking and of their writing, etc., they almost all, to a person, mention the importance of doing their own thinking and how that evolved, and once they made that change, how much it impacted them. And so I want to use an example here of an American inventor and a name that you might have heard before, but maybe not, and that is Buckminster Fuller. And so for those of you who haven't heard of him, let me give you a little bit of background. So he was born in 1895, died in 1983. He was an American architect, systems theorist, writer, designer, inventor, philosopher, and futurist. He published more than 30 books, received 28 U.S. patents, and also received 47 honorary doctorates from U.S. institutions. And you may know him because he popularized the geodesic dome. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to play a video of him talking about this very issue. He was in an interview and asked about his history, and he goes into how he came to do his own thinking. And I really want you to listen to the passion with which he discusses this and how much of an impact it had on him.
And so when I started this, my own thinking, this is 1927, I was 32. That's the point you ask about. And it became a very extraordinary matter to suddenly do your own thinking, and realizing how many times what I'd been thinking was happening in the society, which society didn't think was happening, how many times I'd really been right.
Yeah.
And so I began to, that gave me some courage to think about doing my own thinking. I said, if I'm going to do my own thinking, I'm going to have to give up all the things I've been taught to believe, all the loyalties, all the things you take on, just take on because that's part of the game. And by the word belief, I then said, I mean accepting explanations of physical phenomena without any experimental evidence.
The second tenet of a receptive mind is the ability to embrace cognitive dissonance. Now, 12 years ago, when I started my journey, I had no idea what this meant, and it took my friend Jay, of course, to tell me and bring me into the tent on that one, so thanks, Jay. So I think it's important first for us to understand what cognitive dissonance is and to dispel one rumor that I think may exist about it. So cognitive dissonance is described as the perception of contradictory information and the mental toll of it. And it's the mental toll of it that I think is missing from a lot of people's understandings. According to this theory, when two actions or ideas are not psychologically consistent with each other, people do all in their power to change them until they become consistent. The discomfort is triggered by the person's belief clashing with new information perceived, wherein the individual tries to find a way to resolve the contradiction to reduce their discomfort. And then, at least according to Wikipedia, there are 4 paradigms of cognitive dissonance, and there's one called belief disconfirmation, which I think is very interesting. And that is the contradiction of a belief, ideal, or system of values which causes cognitive dissonance that can be resolved by changing the challenged belief, yet, instead of affecting change, the resultant mental stress restores psychological consonance or agreement to the person by misrepresentation, rejection, or refutation of the contradiction, seeking moral support from people who share the contradicted beliefs, or acting to persuade other people that the contradiction is unreal. So where I would go back and say the ability to embrace cognitive dissonance, this is not just the ability to embrace and hold to contradictory ideas. More importantly, it's the ability to not attempt to have those two come into a line and to become consistent. The third tenet of a receptive mind is the ability to engage in pedestal thinking. That's just a term I made up. It seems to make sense to me. And that is, just like when you're in a museum or somewhere else and you see something on a pedestal, you're able to walk around it and see it from a variety of different angles and vantage points. And the same is true with thinking. It's the ability to take an idea or a concept or an argument or whatever it is and isolate it and be able to walk around it and see it from different angles and different perspectives. The fourth tenet of a receptive mind is the ability to exercise discernment. Now, I think discernment is important to us in all aspects of our lives, but what I'm talking about specifically here is discernment with respect to information and sources of information. So this is really the ability to hone a skill of evaluating sources of information, but also being able to get out of what I'll call your comfort zone of information. You are going to have to look at an eclectic array of information to be able to get closer to the truth and to understand truth. But to do that, you have to have this skill. If you look to others to do that, then you're back to outsourcing your thinking. So you need to be able to develop discernment, and that's a skill. It's going to take time and effort, but it's important. The fifth tenet of a receptive mind is the ability to allow and ultimately welcome anarchy of the mind. Now that may sound a little odd and probably charged given the term anarchy, but let's go ahead and unpack that a bit. So the word anarchy only means no rulers. That's it. No rulers. Although what we're taught these days and what we continue to see are examples of anarchy being used in the context of no rules. So, it is not the scene out of Talladega Nights where Ricky Bobby's kids are running crazy. That's not it, and that is not anarchy. Anarchy is simply having no rulers. So anarchy of the mind is the ability and the process of descaling all of the thinking, all of the conditioning, and all of the propaganda that we've received over time, and be able to let your mind be free. The sixth tenet of a receptive mind is the ability to identify and understand the impact of conditioning. And I thought the best way to demonstrate this would be to talk about two individuals, at least in U.S. history, who have been very influential in this field, and then play a video clip that I think will really summarize and encapsulate what they thought this information should be used to do. So the first is Walter Lippmann. Lived from 1889 to 1974. He was an American writer, reporter, and political commentator. And as I was doing some research on him, I was trying to find out if I could find essentially what the question was he was trying to answer, or the issue he was grappling with. And of course, at least according to Wikipedia, it said he was trying to reconcile the tensions between liberty and democracy in a complex and modern world, to the extent that helps. But with that as background, Lippmann and then a subsequent thinker in this space came up with pretty similar ideas, and so they put the two together and formed this, what they call a consensus, and it has three basic parts. Number one, public opinion is volatile, shifting erratically in response to the most recent developments. Number two, public opinion is incoherent, lacking an organized or a consistent structure to such an extent that the views of U.S. citizens could best be described as, quote, non-attitudes. And number three, public opinion is irrelevant to the policy-making process. Political leaders ignore public opinion because most Americans can neither, quote, understand nor influence the very events upon which their lives and happiness are known to depend, end quote. So the second individual is Edward Bernays. He lived from 1891 to 1995 and was an American theorist, although he was best known as being a pioneer in the field of public relations and propaganda. In fact, in his obituary, he was called the father of public relations. I thought this was pretty interesting. His best-known campaigns include a 1929 effort to promote female smoking by branding cigarettes as feminist, quote, torches of freedom. Clever. And his work for the United Fruit Company in the 1950s connected with the CIA orchestrated overthrow of the democratically elected Guatemalan government in 1954. Nice work. You may know, or if you don't, that his uncle is Sigmund Freud. And his writings and thoughts are essentially boiled down to this. He described the masses as irrational and subject to herd instinct, and he outlined how skilled practitioners could use crowd psychology and psychoanalysis to control them in desired ways. He later synthesized many of these ideas in his post-war book, Public Relations, which outlines the science of managing information released to the public by an organization in a manner most advantageous to the organization. So let's take a look at that clip.
The leading political writer, Walter Lippmann, argued that if human beings were in reality driven by unconscious, irrational forces, then it was necessary to rethink democracy. What was needed was a new elite who could manage what he called the bewildered herd. This would be done through psychological techniques that would control the unconscious feelings of the masses. Edward Bernays was fascinated by Lippmann's arguments, and also saw a way to promote himself by using them. In the 1920s, he began to write a series of books which argued that he had developed the very techniques Lippmann was calling for. By stimulating people's inner desires and then sating them with consumer products, he was creating a new way to manage the irrational force of the masses. He called it the engineering of consent.
And number 7, the final tenet of a receptive mind, arguably the most difficult one on the list, and that is becoming comfortable with saying 6 words. I was wrong, and I don't know. And I would challenge you, I don't know who you have conversations with and who you're dialoguing with on a regular basis, but I hear those spoken infrequently at best. I'm trying to think of the last time I heard somebody say, I was wrong, or I don't know. And the I was wrong is really difficult. The I don't know seems to be something that should be easier to say, right? Because we can't know everything. And yet, when I'm in conversation with people, it seems like no matter what the topic, you bring it up, somebody's got an opinion about it. They've got a belief. They've got some idea about it. But my question is do they really? Or is it just too hard to say, I don't know? Well, that's a wrap for our first, yes, the inaugural episode of the Exit Your Matrix podcast. I hope it's been insightful, helpful, and I hope you'll spend some time thinking about what's been covered today in terms of your own thinking. Next time, we start in with the material in earnest, and I look forward to seeing you then. Be well.